This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will.
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to glean and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now, these people are in very high positions, yeah?
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 79. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we're returning to one of our favorite recent authors, I think I can say, on this podcast.
Yeah, it's part two.
Of a pretty weighty tome that, I think it's been a month or two since we released the first chapter of it, but an incredibly illuminating work from 1910. Actually, I forget when this installment came out, but I think during the 1910s. That is, of course, The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. If we can do a brief previously on, History of the Great American Fortunes, in the first chapter, highly recommend going and listening to it if you haven't. But it basically tracks the origins of the various, economic fortunes of the colonial Americas and in the early United States, and basically the central recurring thesis, which Gustavus Myers pretty much beats to death on every page in some amazing, flowery, denunciatory language, is that pretty much all of the great American fortunes that, in his day were being celebrated and were absolutely dominant, were all secured by fraud, deceit, treachery, murder, manipulation, etc. Bribery,
yeah.
Exactly. Manipulation of the writing of laws itself, and in fact, the entire legal system, and of course, the bribing of political representatives and judges and officials, all the way down the machinery of government, and thus, basically, I think his implication is that these fortunes are not legitimate, even by our own
You
vaunted...
mentioned blackmail. That's another big one.
Blackmail,
I guess it kind of falls
up
under fraud. Fraud is probably the most common word in these volumes. In this whole collection, probably I would say fraud is the most used word, other than the and so and things like that.
Yes. On every page, there is just a copious
certainly in the chapter
fraud.
titles. Most of the chapter titles involve some permutation of wealth secured by fraud, vast wealth secured by fraud. Some title permutation of that is the title of every chapter.
Exactly. The seizure of the public domain, the might of the railroad owners, the legalizing of cunning, the land laws against the poor. This is just in the first chapter. Vast tracts secured by bribery.
Yep, bribery.
He doesn't slow down with the great subheader chapters in Volume 2. It's great. Great extent of the land frauds. Yep.
Yeah.
So basically he tracks kind of from the Volume 1 kind of goes from the early 1600s basically kind of to the period right before the Civil War, and goes through John Jacob Astor is one of the main people that he profiles, and does a pretty good job of showing that all of the bourgeois propaganda that Americans are so heavily inundated with has basically painted a very incorrect picture of the types of the methods by which these great magnates acquired their wealth. It wasn't through their Puritan thrift or their brilliant vision or their steadfast determination to provide a better service at the lowest possible product and deliver maximum value to customers. I mean, they weren't even talking like that back then, but that's the kind of bullshit they'd probably say today. To extol one of our, we're still living in the epoch, I would say, of basically standing billionaires, wouldn't you say, Khalid?
Definitely, yeah. And I think that when these people leave our world, which probably will happen in our lifetime, they're literally going to leave our world and go to outer space. But when they die, the panegyrics that will be treated to about Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and things like that, we'll get Ashton Kutcher has been in the news recently due to his, CIA comments and,
and his venture capital prowess, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm, yeah, his concerns about TikTok being used for geopolitical purposes in the South China Sea. I remember he was in that, Steve Jobs movie that came out right after Steve Jobs' death. There was
I was just thinking about Steve Jobs as an example of somebody who had 5 biopics created about him right after he died.
And the one that was more celebrated was the Aaron Sorkin version where he was he was flawed, he made some missteps, he treated his family poorly, but in a way it was all worth it because he was such a genius, kind of like when President Josiah Bartlett lied about having MS, that was a quote unquote flaw, but it's better than having, the Republicans in there.
True. True.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're also going to see today is the sort of the fake kayfabe of the sort of the dialectic in, American politics, basically, being kayfabe really shine through, I think, in this part where there's really there's very little distinction you can make in the 19th century. I mean, certainly after, I think, the Civil War, in the North at least. I mean, maybe there were regional kind of rivalries that expressed themselves through the two-party system, but it sounds like in the northern cities, you had Democratic machines, and then you had Republican politicians, and they were all doing pretty much the exact same thing, and, the process of, bribing both parties or just, playing them against each other, the ultimate sinister dialectic was something that really became an art form in the Gilded Age, after the Civil War. And some of the personalities in Volume 2 really became masters of the art form. But, Gustavus Myers also points out that these aren't just, individual sickos that, people like, say, Jay Gould, who we'll talk about, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. They weren't just, unique, awful sickos that, even the businessmen at the time were just horrified by their rapacious behavior. No, indeed, they were indicative of the class that they, both either sprang from or aspired to, or both. And their behavior was incredibly typical of the merchant trading classes of the time and the landed elites, right?
Yeah, something that blew my mind was the whole thing with we'll get to Jay Gould eventually, but it was I didn't actually know about this historical event, the Gold Conspiracy, which was known as such in its day. It's been on my mind lately, the connotations of conspiracy. I was recently at, a social gathering where the topic of conspiracy came up, and it just kind of became clear in the course of the conversation that, for many people, and I think this is kind of, known to others, and we've talked about it in the podcast before, but it became clear that for many people, the word conspiracy has become, a synonym for, false, or, an irrational idea. But at, before, JFK's assassination and the sort of poisoning of the term conspiracy with that connotation, there was this widely known and widely decried event that was known as the Gold Conspiracy that, Jay Gould, and his Confederates engaged in order to, while all the while, interestingly, just kind of spewing accusations of conspiracy at unions, at everybody. It's funny.
Constantly. We're gonna get into some false flags here. Some aspects. Gustavus Myers not afraid to throw down the gauntlet in that regard of, erring on the side of, yes, there was probably a conspiracy by Pinkertons and their silk topper
Yeah, he definitely has a
employers.
critical paranoid streak. I want to return to him if we ever do an episode about the Fox sisters, because he was a Fox sisters truther, as I mentioned, which is just great. That really shows.
I definitely want to read his
he's not
spiritualism
all about
book.
cleaving to pieties or anything like that. Yeah, it's
No,
sadly there's not enough crossover. I was hoping that he would have some stuff about which of these people consorted with jinn or evil ghosts, but he didn't really. He was just kind of laying out the proof. Although, yeah, it was separate conspiracies by the skeptoids against spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So I mean, maybe we can start to dive in. I think his opening brings that Gustavus fire and sets the stage, but of basically talking. The main subject of this is the development of the railroads.
Yes,
particularly in the post-Civil War era. So his main focus here, and actually the discussion of the railroads even extends into Volume 3, which we'll cover in a subsequent episode, and I think kind of morphs into the final boss of American capitalism, which is the trusts, at least at the time he was writing it. But before we kind of get into the discussion of the railroads themselves, a huge component of that is the acquisition of land, particularly in the Midwest and the American West at that time. We'll get to that in a second, but maybe we'll just start. We'll check back in with Gustavus Myers in his opening here, Chapter 1, The Seizure of the Public Domain. And he writes, before setting out to relate in detail the narrative of the amassing of the great individual fortunes from railroads, it is advisable to present a preliminary survey of the concatenating circumstances leading up to the time when these vast fortunes were rolled together. Without this explanation, this work would be deficient in clarity and would leave unelucidated many important points, the absence of which might puzzle and vex the reader. Although industrial establishments, as exemplified by mills, factories, and shops, much preceded the construction of railroads, yet the next great group of fortunes to develop after, and along with those from land, were the fortunes plucked from the control and manipulation of railroad systems. So, subheader, the lagging factory fortunes. Under the first stages of the old chaotic competitive system in which factory warred against factory and an intense struggle for survival and ascendancy enveloped the whole tense sphere of manufacturing, no striking industrial fortunes were made. Fortunate was that factory owner regarded who could claim $250,000 clear. All of those modern and complex factors offering such unbounded opportunities for gathering in spoils mounting into the hundreds of millions of dollars were either unknown or in an inchoate or rudimentary state. Invention, if we may put it so, was just blossoming forth. Hand labor was largely prevalent. Huge combinations were undreamed of. Paper capitalization, as embodied in the fictitious issues of immense quantities of bonds and stocks, was not yet part of the devices of the factory owner, although it was a fixed plan of the bankers and insurance companies. That's interesting. The factory owner was the supreme type of that sheer individualism which had burst forth from the restraints of feudalism. He stood alone fighting his commercial contest with persistent personal doggedness. Beneath his occasional benevolence and his religious professions was a wild ardor in the checkmating or bankruptcy of his competitors. These were his enemies. He fought them with every mercantile weapon, and they him, and none gave quarter. Apart from the destructive character of this incessant warfare, dooming many of the combatants, other intervening factors had the tendency of holding back the factory owner's quick progress, obstacles and drawbacks copiously described in later and more appropriate parts of this work. Now, the might of the railroad owners. In contrast to the slow, almost creeping pace of the factory owners in the race for wealth, the railroad owners sprang at once into the lists of mighty wealth possessors, armed with the most comprehensive and puissant powers and privileges, and vested with a sweep of properties besides which those of the petty industrial bosses were puny. Railroad owners, we say. The distinction is necessary between the builders of the railroads and the owners. The one might construct, but it often happened that by means of cunning, fraud, and corruption, the builders were superseded by another set of men who vaulted into possession. Looking back and summing up the course of events for a series of years, it may be said that there was created overnight a number of entities. So this is where he maybe gets a little spiritualistic. Try to read that into it. It was created created overnight a number of entities empowered with extraordinary and far-reaching rights and powers of ownership. These entities were called corporations and were called into being by law. Beginning as creatures of law, the very rights, privileges, and properties obtained by means of law soon enabled them to become the dictators and masters of law. The title was in the corporation, not in the individual. Hence, the men who controlled the corporation swayed the substance of power and ownership. The factory was usually a personal affair, owned by one man or in co-partnership. To get control of this property, it was necessary to get the owner in a financial corner and force him to sell out, for, as a rule, he had no bond or stock issues. But the railroad corporation was a stock corporation. Whoever secured control of a majority of the stock became the legal administrator of its policies and property. By adroit manipulation, intimidation, superior knavery, and the corrupt domination of law, it was always easy for those who understood the science of rigging the stock market and that of strategic undermining to wrest the control away from weak, or, treating the word in a commercial sense, incompetent holders. This has long been shown by a succession of examples. And, so that's, so he says, the legalizing of cunning. Thus, this situation, so singularly conflicting with the theoretical majesty of the law, was frequently presented. A band of men, styling themselves a corporation, received a perpetual charter with the most sweeping rights and properties. In turn, the law interposed no effective hindrance to the seizing of their possessions by any other group proving its power to grasp them. All of this was done under nominal forms of law, but differed little in reality from the methods during medieval times when any baron could take another baron's castle and land by armed force, and it remained his until a stronger man came along and proved his title likewise. Long before the railroad had been accepted commercially as a feasible undertaking, the trading and landowning classes, as had been repeatedly pointed out, had demonstrated very successfully how the forms of government could be perverted to enrich themselves at the expense of the working population. Taxation laws, as we have seen, were so devised that the burden in a direct way fell lightly on the shipping, manufacturing, trading, banking, and landowning classes, while indirectly it was shoved almost wholly upon the workers, whether in shop, factory, or farm. Furthermore, the constant response of government, municipal, state, and national, to property interests has been touched upon. How government loaned vast sums of public money, free of interest, to the traders, while at the same time refusing to assist the impoverished and destitute. How it granted immunity from punishment to the rich and powerful, and inflicted the most drastic penalties upon poor debtors and penniless violators of the law. How it allowed the possessing classes to evade taxation on a large scale, and effected similarly cruel laws permitting landlords to evict tenants for non-payment of rent. These and many other partial and grievously discriminative laws have been referred to as also the refusal of government to interfere in the slightest with the commercial frauds and impositions constantly practiced, with all the resulting great extortions upon the defenseless masses. Of the long prevailing frauds on the part of the capitalists in acquiring large tracts of public land, some significant facts have been brought out in preceding chapters. Those facts, however, are only a few of a mass. When the United States government was organized, most of the land in the North and the East was already expropriated, but immense areas of public domain still remained in the South and in the Middle West. Over much of the former colonial land, the various legislators claimed jurisdiction until, one after another, they ceded it to the national government. With the Louisiana Purchase in 1805, the area of public domain was enormously extended, and consecutively so later, after the Mexican War. So, yeah, he goes on at extreme specificity and length about how, basically in every state, there was rigging and bribery and fraud going on in the actual parceling out of the land itself, and how basically the Homestead Act, which I think, still occasionally gets brought up as this great kind of egalitarian thing that, they did in the mid-1800s. And of course, you could attack it on settler colonial grounds, etc. But Gustavus Myers is saying that they didn't even really give the land to settlers. What they really did is a bunch of these moneyed interests they would pay a bunch of people to travel out west and show up at these land grant offices and claim their parcel, and then turn around and give it to some corporation, basically. Yeah. And this pattern was repeated in the South, in the Midwest, in the Southwest, everywhere.
It's just a gut punch when he talks about how the people basically couldn't do anything, and the entire edifice of democracy was a complete farce. And they went to the state legislature and they demanded a constitutional provision to prevent like the state from bonding railroads, like giving land to railroads, giving away all their resources and all their rights to these railroad companies, and, and all their taxes. But, and so they got this, like adopted this provision that the state couldn't, it forbid the bonding of the state for railroad purposes. But like they didn't forbid counties and municipalities from doing that. So immediately the railroads started to get laws passed, and they just started bribing county officials and municipal officials to issue bonds and give them, all those privileges that they had been getting from the states, just like for absolutely nothing in return. Yeah. It really, again, there's nothing new under the sun with this, because you really see, like in this story, you really see a narrative of how the system that we exist in now, where like people are like complaining about handouts, and all like the the media and all these commentary are totally captured by this ideological like myth that these people aren't like the biggest beneficiaries and the biggest like thieves of taxes and the wealth of the people. We still like operate. You hear that stuff all the time. It's like baked in so deeply. And like when people first saw this happening and were trying to prevent it, they just got completely slammed at every turn.
Yeah, like this little paragraph, he lists so many investigations that were even done in the Senate and stuff, and actually even predating railroads, basically, like going back to like the 1820s and the 1830s. I guess there was an exhaustive report from the United States Senate Committee on Lands in March 1835. And he writes, many of the speculators, it said, filled high offices in states where public lands bought by them were located. Others were people of, quote, wealth and intelligence. All of them, quote, naturally united to render this investigation odious among the people. The committee told how an attempt had been made to assassinate one of its members. The first step, it set forth, necessary to the success of every scheme of speculation in the public lands, is to corrupt the land officers by a secret understanding between the parties that they are to receive a certain portion of the profits. The committee continued, the state of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana have been the principal theater of speculations and frauds in buying up the public lands and dividing the most enormous profits between the members of the different companies and speculators. The committee refers to the depositions of numerous respectable witnesses to attest the various ramifications of these speculations and frauds and the means by which they have been carried into effect. I mean, they tried to assassinate like one of the, maybe one of the senators, U.S. senators, trying to even poke into what was going on with all these land deals. So,
it reminds me a lot, actually, of something we talked about recently on a Q&A about Bill Gates, like buying up all this land, like all this agricultural land. And it's the same.
Truly ain't nothing new.
Yeah, there really is nothing new under the sun in this case, because it's the same sort of thing where like there's kind of like a humanitarian gloss over it. With like, we're looking out for, in this case, they were like, we're looking out for the man a few dollars. We want to encourage him to go out and settle in the Great West. When really they were just doing a massive land grab under the auspices of the state.
Yes. Yeah. This is what a U.S. district attorney wrote in a letter to President Andrew Jackson in 1835. Governments, like corporations, are considered without souls, and according to the code of some people's morality, should be swindled and cheated on every occasion. Linton gave this picture of, quote, a notorious speculator who has an immense extent of claims. He could be seen followed to and fro from the land office by crowds of free Negroes, Indians, and Spaniards, and the very lowest dregs of society in the counties of Opelousas and Rapides, with their affidavits already prepared by himself and sworn to before some justice of the peace in some remote county. These claims, to an immense extent, are presented and allowed. And upon what evidence? Simply upon the evidence of the parties themselves who desire to make the entry. So, yeah, that was, so then I guess the system of credit, they eventually phased out, I guess, around that time. I guess it was controversial enough. But then they were still doing auctions, I guess, like nominally selling things at $1.25 an acre. But then I think what he also goes into in other states, particularly in California, was going in and classifying the land as like that you knew had, say, mineral deposits or was good cattle grazing land, basically bribing a like land officer to go out there and classify it as like wasteland or desert or swampland. So then the government would sell it to the interested party for like 25 cents an acre, and then once they owned it, they could like turn around and flip it for like $5, like $5 an acre or something like that. And they just did this systematically, and they would use poor people as cutouts to do it.
This is like an insane part of the book. So this is defrauding the nation of taxes. Not merely were these huge areas of land obtained by fraud, but after they were secured, fraud was further used to evade taxation. And by donations of land is not meant only that for intended railroad use, or which could be sold by the railroads. In some cases, notably that of the Union Pacific Railroad, authority was given to the railroad by acts passed in 1862 and 1864 to take all of the materials, such as stone, timber, etc., needed for construction from public lands. So in addition to the money and lands, much of the essential material for building the railroads was supplied from public resources. No sooner had they obtained their grants than the railroad corporations had law after law passed, removing this restriction or that reservation until they became absolute masters of hundreds of millions of acres of land, which a brief time before had been national property. And then he quotes from, another scholar, a congressman. These enormous tracts, wrote in 1886 William A. Phillips, a member of the Committee on Public Lands of the 43rd Congress, referring to the railroad grants, are in their disposition subject to the will of the railroad companies. They can dispose of them in enormous tracts if they please, and there is not a single safeguard to secure this portion of the national domain to cultivating yeomanry. The whole machinery of legislation was not only used to exclude the farmer from getting the land and to centralize its ownership in corporations, but was additionally employed in relieving these corporations from taxation on the land, thus obtained by fraud. To avoid taxation, Philip goes on, the railroad land grant companies had an amendment enacted into law to the effect that they should not obtain their patents until they had paid a small fee to defray the expense of surveying. This they took care not to pay, or only to pay as fast as they could sell tracts to some purchasers, on which occasions they paid the surveying fee and obtained deeds for the portions they sold. In this way, they have held millions of acres for speculative purposes, waiting for a rise in prices without taxation, while the farmers in adjacent lands paid taxes. And then he says, Philip passes this fact by with a casual mention, as though it were one of no great significance. He says it's a fact well worthy of elaboration, precisely as the aristocracies in the old world had gotten their estates by force and fraud, and then had the laws so arranged to exempt those estates from taxation, it's the same way here. Yeah, and he goes on to talk, he talks a lot about the railroads, but then he is clear to sort of say, I don't want to be prejudicial and say that it was only the railroads because it was also the livestock corporations and the timber corporations.
Yep, and later on the copper mining corporation, mineral ore, silver, copper, things like that were in the Southwest. Everybody was getting in on it, and they all acted in the same rapacious ways and manipulated the legislatures, and basically defrauded the taxpayer,
this is what
basically left and right.
This is what I think you were talking about with the Homestead Act was, I think this is similar. It was a desert land law where, the whole idea was that, the poor man would, go and get these lands in the desert. And according to Myers, many a pathetic and enthusiastic speech was made in Congress as this act was ostentatiously going through. Under this law, it was claimed a man could establish himself upon 640 acres of land, and upon irrigating a portion of it and paying $1.25 an acre could secure a title. For once, it seemed, Congress was looking out for the interests of the man of few dollars. Then there's a new section called Vast Thefts of Land. But plaudits were too hasty. To the utter surprise of the people, the law began to work in a perverse direction. Its provisions had read well enough on casual scrutiny. Where lay the trouble? It lay in just a few words deftly thrown in, which the crowd did not notice. This law, acclaimed as one of great benefit to every man aspiring for a home and land, was arranged that the capitalist cattle syndicates could get immense areas. The lever was the omission of any provision requiring actual settlement. It reminds me of Bill Gates's lawyers buying up all these land and just letting it just waste away, or farming it in the most destructive ways while posing as this great environmentalist. The livestock corporations thereupon sent in their swarms of dummies to the desert lands, many of which were in reality not desert but excellent grazing lands, had their dummies get patents from the government and then transfer the lands. In this way, the cattlemen became possessed of enormous areas, and today these tracts thus gotten by fraud are securely held intact, forming what may be called great estates, for on many of them lived the owners in expansive manorial style. In numerous instances, law was entirely dispensed with. Vast tracts of land were boldly appropriated by sheep and cattle rangers who had not even a pretense of title. Enclosing these lands with fences, the rangers claimed them as their own and hired armed guards to drive off intruders and kill if necessary. Murder after murder was committed. In this usurpation, the August Supreme Court United States upheld them, and the grounds of the decision were what? The very extraordinary dictum that a settler could not claim any right of preemption on public lands in possession of another who had enclosed, settled upon, or improved them. This was the very reverse of every known declaration of common and of statute law. No court, supreme or inferior, had ever held that because the proceeds of theft were improved or were refurbished a bit, the sufferer was thereby stopped from recovery. This decision showed anew how, while the courts were ever ready to enforce the law literally against the underlings and the penniless, they were as active in fabricating torturous constructions coinciding not always, but nearly always, with the demands and interests of the capitalist class.
Wow. That really is amazing that they could come up with that kind of legal jujitsu that you could you could bribe a land officer to go to like decent grazing land and say like it's a shitty swamp, it's worthless, and maybe somebody else is like living there, and then the person goes and like puts up fences and kicks them out, and the explanation of why they can do that is, well, this was classified as shitty like swampland, and now look, it's grazing, so he must have improved it, therefore he gets to own it now. That's kind of what they're saying, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not or just like whatever they put on it is an improvement. Maybe
that's
it doesn't
certainly
even have to be
exactly. Well, if you like went out there and you
swampland.
built a fence, as long as they liked who was doing it, then they would rule like, actually, they improved it, they settled there, so it's theirs now. Like, kind of, they were like finders keepers because they put up some barbed wire and it's part of their, estate now.
I'm just hearing The Last Resort like playing in my head right now. Like, fuck these people.
Yeah, but
some rich man come and they did rape the land and nobody caught them because they were all being bribed.
An interesting theme,
much.
I think, in this volume, and he talks about this a little bit with the gold conspiracy, which was at the time, something that was, like I said, like really decried, and really denounced as like a huge abuse. But he says, even in our popular conception now, we think of like the, Cornelius Vanderbilt and all these people as being like huge abusive, like barons, the robber barons, the railroad barons. But something that he returns to again and again is that there's this micro focus on these certain people or these certain industries when really like it's this whole system that should be indicted. Like people are saying like, oh, these railroads are to blame, out of like zeal and like maybe their hearts are in the right place, but really they're like not really that much worse or aren't really worse from these other industries like timber and livestock. And, these, like, the gold conspiracy, like Jay Gould's, like, a ridiculous fraud, which we'll probably at least touch on, was, just part and parcel of the way Wall Street functioned.
Yeah, and the whole capitalist economy. I think that given all the recent, like, discourse that, we've seen or maybe dabbled in about the interplay between like broad structural forces and like a kind of classical like Marxist analysis of history and like the broader dynamics and kind of the framework or the heuristic of kind of conspiracy, looking into it, and I don't know, feeling pressure to like pick one or the other. And I think what we've always tried to do is like engage in a dialectic on this podcast where I think we're trying to like find a kind of synthesis between those two things, because I think that because he does, I think Myers is like a great example of an attempt to do that in his era, because like you're right, like even though he's doing very in-depth kind of profiles on individual robber barons who are very well known and already have had some bad things like said about them, and it's like easy to vilify them. He never lets you forget. He reminds you like every 5 pages that like these people are not unique, and like we shouldn't let the entire class off the hook, and it's not about people's behavior. He's constantly doing like liberal checks on people to be like, no, the solution is not just to like prevent bad guys like this from getting too much, like too much power.
Right. Yeah.
It's absolutely baked into the entire system. It is a system of like fraud and theft, basically on a mass scale that is sanctified by the law and draped in all of this like democratic propaganda about how, like, you know, basically this trickery, like they're psyoping people, folks, but they're doing it as a class. And so, but, you know, I think it's very illuminating to look at the individual cases and the specific histories of the frauds, because how are you ever going to overcome it if you don't actually examine it very closely?
Yes, and also,
like, if we're just going to be like, these guys aren't that important because they're all just bad.
Well,
like,
right.
I don't think that's quite what he's saying.
Yeah, you know, the classic Amy argument of if Donald Rumsfeld hadn't been vice president of the United States, then, you know, somebody else would have been. I saw some amazing thing, you know, I guess this has been going around on Twitter, maybe this debate. I saw something that was like, these systems work independently of actors. I think that the person who tweeted that actually deleted it because it was so absurd, you know, because I replied to it saying like, oh, independently of actors? Like, tell me more. But I never got a response. Like, the idea that, like, what? Like, if there were no people, then, like, somehow, like, the structural forces would still operate, like,
right?
And, like, create, like, sand golems to, like, do capitalism, like, out of thin air. Like, it doesn't, you know, like, obviously there is an element of, like, choice and human action taking place. Like, yes, structural forces are at play. Like, I think that, you know, that people's inclinations and their environment are always, in a way, interacting. But I think you know, and I think that to some extent, the, like, broad structural forces thing where it's like, we have to say that it's a faceless maw and, like, not name anybody directly, or that's not, like, really what I feel Marx was like. I think that is more like what people in academia are like, who don't have tenure yet and are afraid of being political. Like, so they can't like name anything specifically, so they need to be as abstract as possible. That's like what I think that approach to broad structural forces is like about. Yeah, like, honestly, like, I don't think that that's like the real, like, really what Capital or most of Marx's writing are like. They're very much in the heat of, like, the times and engage with, like, the political issues of the day, like, in specific terms. They're not like, well, you know, it's all, like, theory brain stuff, you know, about, like, you know, the abstract stuff about Lenin or whatever. Like, you know, that's not... Totally.
You know, I think, you know, I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to, like, butcher the paraphrase of this, but, like, you know, one of his famous axioms was, you know, like, men create their own destiny, but, like, not under the circumstances of their own choosing. So, like, they're inherently, deeply impacted by the society they're living in and, like, the economic system and their own position and, like, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, you know, I think he probably was pushing back against a certain amount of, like, great manism in historical analysis in his time, but at the same time, he wasn't doing what I think that is a very academic, like, don't have tenure yet kind of thing today. If you are going to talk in, like, Marxist terms, you're going to keep it so abstract. And, you know, like, I saw another, I think, tweet in that same thread that was like, well, like, you just don't understand it because, like, the proletarian is the subject of, like, history, but actually the object subject. I'm just like, stop, like, just fucking stop. Like, what are you doing? Like, nobody, that's not gonna fucking make sense to anybody. Just, like, quit it.
Yeah,
like,
I honestly I saw that too, and I couldn't parse it. I almost thought that was a joke.
It might be a joke. It might be a joke. But I do believe it's believable that some people do kind of approach it from that angle. That's like, you know, I mean, I get it. Like, you know, a lot of these guys like Deleuze can be interesting and stuff. But, like, also, like, if we're talking about if you're coming at us trying to say that conspiracy is totally irrelevant and doesn't get people galvanized at all, and it's, like, not relatable to, like, the working masses, but, like, talking about how, like, you are, like, a subject-object class that needs to, like, achieve sentience, like, come on, you know what I mean? Like, instead of being like, did you know that, like or
the problem of, like, conspiracism. I think that honestly, like, you know, I've gained an appreciation, I think, for how, like, deliberately deployed and the idea of conspiracy is like a toxic term, because it is something that can just, you know, it signifies, like, inherently, like, this is irrational, you know, this can't happen, when, like, of course there are conspiracies all the time, like documented historical conspiracies, like the Tuskegee experiments, which, like, you know,
it's also on the law books. Like, it's literally a crime.
Like,
in, like, every country, pretty much. And in our system,
for whatever reason,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And, like, you know, so if there's this idea that, everything is entirely deterministic in some way, and like people don't have the ability to act, like, for instance, like, the capitalist class, they don't, like, they're not involved in their decisions to like traffic children or something, like they are just enacting, like the geist of their class. I don't think that is like really, I don't think that's what Karl Marx thought, honestly, at all. And I just think that is like, if that's the case, well then that's all right, fine. Like then we just like do nothing, like just sit around, say nothing. I guess just talk about how like, these broad structural forces of capital are bad. Like it doesn't have anything to do with certain. Then you're in violation agencies. I mean, at what point can you say something? Like can you say that like this empire or this like structure system or a geopolitical organization is acting out its or it's I guess this geopolitical organization is enacting its will, or like that, for instance, like can we indict like the Spain for committing genocide like in South America? Like is that something that we can criticize, or it's only like individuals? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it weirdly gets into this like weird territory. Where does it break down? Like where? Well, exactly. I mean, at a certain point, you have to hold like people responsible because people are inherent to these things existing. Because actually, you know what? This whole thing, it feels like a complete violation of like the spirit of Marx, in that he talks about how like basically like the broad structural forces of history are all literally driven from like human labor and human activity in like an organized way. So like everything does stem from humans affecting their environment, like from the very basis of like hunter-gatherer society up through that is kind of his overall frame, is that like and also like the idea that the point of philosophy is not merely to describe the world but to change it. You're kind of throwing that out of the window when you just say, it doesn't matter anything specifically, like it's just broad structural forces, and like we just have to wait around for the moment, like the rapture to happen, the communist rapture to happen, and then like, when the time is right, we just need to wait around, and then when the conditions mature, then we will all just like spontaneously rise. That sounds like some anarchist type thinking, that like we're just going to believe in the magic of the geist. I almost feel like it's, again, to go back to the point about like an academic who doesn't have tenure yet, I think it's kind of a class signifier too, to be like, oh, I'm too smart to think to like blame individuals, like I understand the structural forces at play. Like I don't get like deep in the weeds of that. I'm all about like the structures that are happening. Well, we've talked about the like gaucheness of calling out certain types of people, or asking about like their, I don't know, somebody like Leslie Kean. I could imagine if you were at that gathering with your liberal friends and you started talking about how like, did you know Leslie Kean's like family like founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and her uncle is like on the 9/11 commission, and like all these other things, and implying that there was something nefarious about her level of privilege. I think you get hard. A more compelling line of attack on Leslie Kean in that context would probably be to just be like, she believes in aliens or whatever. That's true, actually. She's actually a wacky conspiracy theorist. That would work on them, but because that's ontologically acceptable. But they don't like to kind of look. They don't like to look at these, like somebody like the guy you see on CNN every night is a Vanderbilt. But we don't like to talk about that, do we? Like, there are, like, and I think that this does come through in Gustavus Meyer's book, where he's talking about, like, how the courts, for instance, they made a decision to support the capitalists. They could have done what they did when paupers or people who didn't have means came before them and interpret the law literally, but they chose to rule with the capitalists because people are creating the legal theory to sustain this, and they're not doing it with full unconsciousness. They're not. Somebody has to be conscious at some point for a system like this to exist. Like, I get that there are a lot of people who are kind of like cogs in the machine, and they've bought the kind of exoteric narrative, and maybe they don't see themselves as like absolute like working for rapacious robber baron psychos. No, they think that what they're doing is justified, but they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. The people who are the Indian swindlers out working for Astor, the people scamming the land deals. I think that perhaps deep down they do maybe have a sense. I really don't know because I've never like defrauded a mass of people. I can definitely say that I would know that was bad and I would feel guilty. I can't really see inside their like ethical sensibility, but I do think that people tend to, with some exceptions, like, you know, the shaitans of the human race, those accepted, you know, I think that people tend to have a certain like ethical sensibility and to sort of recoil from doing like egregious harm to their fellow people, even like if there's a certain distance that they can, you know, the more distance the better, but even if it is there, then I think people tend to recoil from that, and maybe they can suppress it, but so maybe they do have some sense in which they know what they're doing, but, you know, they need to work to justify it.
And you know, think about all the ideological work that had to go into like the media, the clergy, like
because that's like where all these legal
the
justifications, they have to, you know, exactly. Like, in fact, Marx really was part of the ongoing dialectic or the discourse of legitimation for, you know, he was engaging with it and responding to it. Like the discourse of the legitimation of capitalism that had happened over centuries, you know, going even like to John Locke, you know, and to Adam Smith. They were people who created the ideological scaffolding for these types of things. Hobbes, you know, so
yeah, and part of that was like telling everybody, all your assets in the media, that anybody talking about the JFK conspiracy is a conspiracy theorist and probably a communist asset, so you shouldn't listen to them. You know, like truly ain't nothing new. We have to like confront this dynamic in American history.
I mean, I haven't read Hobbes like in a long time, but I am kind of thinking in you know, the context of this conversation, I'm thinking of that famous image of the king's body that often accompanies the Leviathan. You often see it used to illustrate the Leviathan. I don't know if Hobbes drew it, but I think it was the original frontispiece. So someone drew it, probably for Leviathan. It's like the king's body being made up of the whole mass of people, you know, because the whole theory is that like the sovereign acts in the name of the assembled people, you know, and you can kind of see like, you know, you can see a parallel with that, like in the idea of like, oh, you know, it's society really, like this king, like when he's, you know, this sovereign force, when he's making these determinations and, you know, deciding what is licit and what's illicit. He is acting in the name of the people, and that's where he derives his power from. You can see a parallel between that and the idea that, like, oh, you know, individual actors are irrelevant, you know, it's all broad-spectral forces. And you can also see a parallel to the way that these corporations often have acted using the political apparatus of democracy as, like, a shield and as a sham to base, like, various predations on. And
in a way that is incredibly like direct, because they basically, it was, we'll probably get into it a lot with the Jay Gould's escapades, but the amount of like literally bribing judges in cities like New York and stuff like that, like these people they started collecting politicians like little action figures basically. And what you saw with the rise of like the chartered corporation in kind of the mid 1800s was this new, more supercharged model of capitalist expansion, where you could hire this army of lawyers and accountants and like lobbyists and things like that, and basically through all kinds of, you know, really kind of a more sophisticated version of what the earlier kind of patroon descendants did in New York of, you know, getting favorable laws passed, like basically, doing the most twisted things with the legal system to get the public budget to pay for everything. So it's like, I don't know, we've brought up before how, and I know a lot of people talk about how, you know, like these Silicon Valley companies don't pay any taxes today, but the internet was basically built by the U.S. military and like U.S. taxpayer dollars. So how does that make sense? That like the entire infrastructure and R&D was like developed by the common fund, but then like Jeff Bezos gets to build a big dick rocket and fly to space, so like with his funny money, and like we just accept that, well, he built Amazon. You know, like he had the vision to build it. And like I've heard people kind of like just casually make those arguments. Or like, why does Bill Gates deserve more than $1 billion? You know, I try to make it easy for people. Like, why does anybody deserve more than $1 billion? They're like, yeah, but he built Amazon. Like, he had the idea for it. I'm like, did he build it like by himself? Like just alone in his garage? He built the entire multi-billion-dollar operation, you know? Or did like thousands of people build it? And it's you could go a million ways with that, but there's still like a huge resistance to that idea of, I don't know, which in many cases is just like paying the legal system to manipulate the law to like give you something approaching a monopoly. And it's like not even
and once once people once the people who are creating the laws like are creating the referring to the ideological justification for it in their circles, like within their class environment, once they create the laws and thereby create the practices and the structures of society, then like those ideologies become more ossified within the society. They become sort of a matter of course, because this is how we always remember it having been. It seems totally natural that, people should be billionaires because, the laws that we operate by that make that possible have the ideology and the decision baked into them. This is actually a great part of the book, it's titled, which is very relevant to what you're saying. It's called Seizure of Immense Areas by Fraud, which is very similar to the previous Seizure of Vast Tracts by Fraud, but a different part. So, official reports of the period, contemporaneous with the original seizure of these immense tracts of land, give far more specific details of the methods by which that land was obtained. Of the numerous reports of committees of the California legislature, we will here simply quote one, that of the Swamp Land Investigating Committee of the California Assembly of 1873. Dealing with the fraudulent methods by which huge areas of the finest lands in California were obtained for practically nothing as quote-unquote swamp land, this committee reported, citing from what it termed a mighty mass of evidence, that through the connivance of parties, surveyors were appointed who segregated lands as swamp, which were not so in fact. The corruption existing in the land department of the general government has aided the system of fraud. Also, the committee commented with deep irony, the loose laws of the state, governing all classes of state lands, has enabled wealthy parties to obtain much of it under circumstances which, in some countries, where laws are more rigid and terms less refined, would be termed fraudulent, but we can only designate it as keen foresight and wise.
Of course, yeah. And
yes,
I think
wise
what was the number?
Of loose, unwholesome laws. Nice.
Yeah, I noticed that the amount of land owned by several people in California by kind of the end of the century was absolutely staggering. It was there were 5 people that owned hundreds of thousands of acres or something. I forget. I'm trying to see here. Shout outs, by the way, to Commissioner Sparks of the the land department. He was onto them. Critical support for Commissioner Sparks, who really tried to do everything he could. He described a case where it was discovered by special agents in California that an English firm, LaRouche Alert, had obtained 100,000 acres of the choicest redwood lands in that state. These lands were then estimated to be worth $100 an acre. The cost of procuring surveys and fraudulent entries did not probably exceed $3 an acre. In the same manner, Commissioner Sparks continued, extensive coal deposits in our Western Territory are acquired en masse through expedited surveys, followed by fraudulent preemption and commuted homestead entries. He went on to tell that nearly the whole of territory of Wyoming and large portions of Montana had been surveyed under the deposit system, and the lands on the streams fraudulently taken up under the Desert Land Act to the exclusion of actual settlers. Nearly all of Colorado, the very best cattle-raising portions of New Mexico, the rich timberlands of California, and the splendid forest lands of Washington Territory and the principal part of the extensive pine lands of Minnesota had been fraudulently seized in the same way. In all the western states and territories, these fraudulent surveys had accomplished the seizure of the best and most valuable lands. Quote, to enable the pressing tide of Western immigration to secure homes upon the public domain, Commissioner Sparks urged, it is necessary that hundreds of millions of acres of public lands now appropriated should be wrested from illegal control. But nothing was done to recover these stolen lands. At the very time Commissioner Sparks, one of the very few incorruptible commissioners of public lands, was writing this, the land-grabbing interests were making the greatest exertions to get him removed. During his tenure of office, they caused him to be malevolently harassed and assailed. After he left office, they resumed complete domination of the Land Commissioners Bureau. Cool. So, Commissioner Sparks tried to fight them, but, you really can't fight these people, and they'll just take over the department afterwards. That was the general kind of of vibe.
I just had this thought that, it kind of reminds me when the whole thing of they're just acting out, the the Geist of their class. You know, this is just how the mechanisms of capitalism work. You know, the bourgeoisie, they can't help it but act this way. You know, it's kind of reminds me a little bit of when, you know, I think is something that came up earlier in another episode where, you know, we read that thing where someone was like, well, you know, yes, David Bowie, you know, raped 1 million people, but that was the culture of the time. You know, that was just how it was, like, in these rock communities. But, you know, that's not actually true. Like, people did know it was wrong, and people said at the time that it was wrong, but they were just lame. And you're caping for David Bowie because you like his music, so you don't want to believe that he did anything wrong. But it's harder to explain why people are caping for capitalists and, like, you know, Satan-worshipping Bohemian Grove owl men. But
literally probably the people who founded Bohemian Grove are like Stanford and Crocker and all these psychos.
But yeah, you know, like Commissioner Sparks knew that this land grab was wrong. Even like there were even people like who weren't Native Americans who knew that like the original land theft from Native Americans was wrong, and really that was still ongoing at this time. People knew that it was wrong, but you know, the people who won out were the people who didn't care, and who either didn't think that it was wrong or didn't care.
Yeah, exactly. It also brings like an interesting thing. Maybe we'll get more into it with both Vanderbilt and Gould. There's a new interesting kind of like three-way triple threat trialectic, I guess you could say, going on that kind of emerges later in the 19th century, where you kind of have like three dominant like classes of people, where you have like the robber baron, the fraud class basically at the top, and then you have like the working masses who are increasingly in earnest starting to organize and like, you know, basically start to defend their interests. But then there was like the middle classes, the petty bourgeois class, and they also, like, I've noticed this before reading other things about the Gilded Age, they occupied an interesting position because they were the ones kind of most like sentimentally attached to the narrative of what America was supposed to be. And I think you can still see it today, like with middle class people that kind of become like they kind of hate corporations, but they're also really reactionary and like hate poor people kind of thing, you know, where like, I mean, just look at Tucker right now. Like, I think he's kind of speaking to that like middle class, like that angry middle class component. But, you know, they looked at people like Vanderbilt as like a monster who's going to devour the system of free competition. But they also like kind of identified a little bit with those robber barons because they were exploiting the shit out of their workers and wanted to, you know, they wanted the system to kind of stay more or less the way that it was, with like smaller businesses like freely competing, and so they were very anti-monopoly. And so like depending on what was going on at the moment, they could temporarily sort of shift more to like take the side of the workers, but at the first inkling that the wealthier classes would kind of cut them in or give them what they want, they would immediately side against the workers and become like their, you know, some of the most hostile opponents. But then like they keep constantly getting betrayed and screwed over like consistently as we get to like the end of the 1800s, and it creates. But I think like that's kind of like the Homestead dream is like a very like middle class, you know, aspiration for this era, and the fact that like at every turn, like they too are mostly getting screwed over unless they like fully join the
right. Yeah, he talked about how the middle class. Well, he even says the middle class, comprising the small business and factory men, stubbornly insisted on adhering to worn-out methods of doing business. Its only conception of industry was that of the methods of the year 1825. It refused to see that the centralization of industry was inevitable, and that it meant progress. It lamented the decay of its own power, and tried by every means at its command to thwart the purposes of the trusts. It's crazy he's talking about the decline of the middle class, like even then. This middle class had bribed and cheated and had exploited the worker. For decades it had shaped public opinion to support the dictum that competition was the life of trade. It had, by this shaping of opinion, enrolled on its side a large number of workers who saw only the temporary evils, and not the ultimate good, involved in the scientific organization and centralization of industry. Wow. The middle class put through antitrust laws and other measure after measure aimed at the great combinations. These great combinations had, therefore, a double fight on their hands. On the one hand, they had to resist the trade unions, and on the other, the middle class. It was necessary to their interests that centralization of industry should continue. In fact, it was historically and economically necessary. Consequently, they had to bend every effort to make nugatory any effort of government, both national and state, to enforce the antitrust laws. The thing that had to be done no matter how. it was intolerable that industrial development could be stopped by a middle class which, for self-interest, would have kept matters at a standstill. Self-interest likewise demanded that the nascent combinations and trusts get and exercise governmental power by any means they could use. For a while triumphant in passing certain laws which, it was fatuously expected, would wipe the trusts out of existence, the middle class was hopelessly beaten and routed. By their far greater command of resources and money, the great magnates were able to frustrate the execution of those laws, and gradually to install themselves or their tools in practically supreme power. The middle class is now becoming a mere memory. Even the frantic efforts of President Roosevelt in its behalf were of absolutely no avail. The trusts are mightier than ever before, and hold a sway the disputing of which is ineffective.
Wow, that sounds like you could be talking about like 2021 and like the MAGA and Brexit type constituencies that are like, we don't want your globalism, you know, exactly. And then they're just like we're building a wall, like, and then you know these really trust elitists on the East Coast are like, oh, this is so inconvenient, you know, and they just want to like, you know, and then maybe even I don't know, it's an interesting. It is crazy how relevant it is to today, just like modern U.S. politics, that same dynamic of like thinking that, you know, like a Teddy Roosevelt type figure, a boisterous Teddy Roosevelt style president is going to come in there and like bust up Facebook because they're doing critical race theory.
How there's like, exactly. Teddy Roosevelt's going to come in, and stop, you know, he's going to do like populism or whatever on behalf of like the sort of aggrieved reactionary middle class that just wants to exploit the workers in a different way.
Exactly. But if you go after the silk toppers, they're not going to lie down and take it. Because,
exactly.
You know,
and ultimately,
we all know, as Siskel said, they run this country.
Yeah, no
or they
matter
did back
what,
then, certainly.
No matter what, the working people get completely screwed, and the silk toppers basically get what they want. I mean, maybe one silk topper will win out over another, but it's, you know, some silk topper and eventually wins the day.
The trusts of trusts will increase in power.
Biggest land grab since Columbus started to snatching this land from the skins. In the 21st century, some men behind closed doors started doing the same thing all over again. Books is all about the land to the Gulf of Mexico. Lord, I want all y'all to know, without our wetlands, we all heard it. And I'm gonna tell you, it's Cheney and a Halliburton. The land of bayous, swamps and rivers, water ships shake this land. Lord has been doing that forever. Big corporations got